With the Easter holiday upon us, my next guest is a theologian and author of the New York Times best-selling book, Zealot, The Life and Times of Jesus of Nazareth, Reza Aslan. Now, you may remember Reza from this famous confrontation about his work on Fox News.
I want to clarify, you're a Muslim, so why did you write a book about the founder of Christianity?
Well, to be clear, I am a scholar of religions with 4 degrees, including one in the New Testament and fluency in Biblical Greek.
Still begs the question, why would you be interested in the founder of Christianity?
Because it's my job as an academic. I am a professor of religion, including the New Testament. That's what I do for a living, actually.
Yes, it seemed hard for Fox to comprehend anything outside of a white, born-again Christian writing about Jesus. But Reza's fascinating and meticulous research on Jesus of Nazareth that goes against the grain of everything we've been told is exactly why I wanted him on this show. Reza joined me earlier to discuss his book, and I first asked him how he arrived at the conclusion that Jesus was a revolutionary political leader rather than the peaceful prophet mainstream culture teaches us.
It's just a matter of putting Jesus in the world in which he lived. I mean, first century Palestine was a time awash in apocalyptic expectation. There were countless preachers and prophets and bandits and messiahs who were walking around performing miracles, healing the sick, exorcising demons, talking about the coming order of God, the kingdom of God. Many of them, as I say, declared themselves to be the Messiah. And Jesus very much fits within this spectrum of revolutionaries that came before and after him. And it's also important to understand that this isn't so much a political biography of Jesus. That's the wrong way to think about it. In Jesus' time, there is absolutely no difference between religion and politics. I don't mean to say that they use the same language or exist in the same field. I literally mean there is no difference whatsoever between religion and politics. They are one and the same. So this book is a reminder to people of something that they should already know, which is that every seemingly religious word that came out of Jesus' mouth had clear, unmistakable political ramifications. And this is a reminder of what those political ramifications would have been.
What was the advantage for the early Christian church and even today's church to downplay kind of these more radical elements of Jesus' life?
There's this conscious effort in the Gospels to spiritualize Jesus' message. The kingdom of God, it's not a real kingdom, it's a heavenly kingdom, etc., etc. And then the other thing, too, is to sort of de-Judify Jesus. In other words, you don't want to keep preaching this gospel to Jews whose religion is no longer a legitimate religion in the Roman Empire. You want to start preaching it to non-Jews, to Romans. And to do that, you also have to sort of remove some of the overt Jewish quality of Jesus's teachings and turn them into abstract ethical principles that all people can abide by. That's what the Gospels represent, a deliberate attempt to de-emphasize Jesus's Judaism and to de-emphasize some of the more radical political connotations to his teachings.
And talk about the Council of Nicaea, which was the first council assembled to attain that consensus on the tenets of early Christianity. What was the significance of that?
Well, the Council of Nicaea, which takes place in the middle of the 4th century, happens after the conversion of the Emperor Constantine to Christianity and sort of the establishment of this religion very soon to be established as the only official religion of the Roman Empire. Before this time, before the Council of Nicaea, you can't really say that there was such a thing as Christianity. There were Christianities, many, many different strands, many different interpretations of what this movement actually meant. But of course, you can't make an imperial religion out of something that comes in 100 different flavors. As Constantine reminded the bishops that he gathered together at Nicaea, this religion can only be one thing. And so it was these men who were tasked in this council with figuring out what that one thing is. And that is sort of where what we now consider to be Christian orthodoxy was born. And of course, all those Christians who disagreed with that orthodoxy overnight became heretics and were either forced to convert to the orthodox position or were burned at the stake or actually fled from the Roman Empire. And interestingly enough, they fled primarily into the Middle East.
Reza, a point often brought up by atheists is that Jesus was actually an amalgamation of different historical and mythical figures, such as Egyptian deities, Greek philosopher. What is your response to that argument?
Well, that's true about the Christ. The Christ, which is this sort of spiritual interpretation of the historical Jesus, was unquestionably influenced by a whole host of religious and political ideologies that existed in the first century throughout the Roman Empire. And of course, a lot of that has to do with Hellenistic and Roman thought as well as Egyptian thought. But it's not true about the Jesus of history. The man himself, the marginal Jewish peasant who lived in the backwoods of Galilee 2,000 years ago, was an actual person. And you can, it's very difficult, but you can pry the Christ of faith, the sort of mythological, legendary Christ. You can pry that figure from the historical person himself and make some very, I think, key fundamental conclusions about who Jesus as a Jew preaching Judaism to other Jews would have been. And that's really what my book is about. It's not about Jesus Christ. It's about the Jesus of history, Jesus of Nazareth.
Right, and you've talked about the difficulty of seeing Jesus as a man rather than just a God. Why is it so troubling for so many Christians to separate the two and understand Jesus through this pure historical perspective?
Well, the foundation of Christianity is that Jesus is both fully God and fully man, that he is both these things at once. And frankly, that's a mystery that is very difficult for the human mind to wrap itself around. I mean, the God part of Jesus subsumes the man part. It becomes very difficult to think of him as having human emotions or, for that matter, human motivations, because after all, while he may have been in human form, he was God. And so therefore, his words and actions are eternal and universal. Context plays no role in figuring out who he was or what he meant. He is acontextual. He has always existed and will always exist. That kind of figure becomes very difficult for the historian to talk about. And so when one tries to get to the core of the man himself, to put aside his divine nature and focus solely on the humanity of Jesus, and more importantly, to provide him with human motivations for the things that he does and he says, well, as you can imagine, that can be somewhat offensive or difficult to swallow for certain people of faith. But the truth of the matter is that at least the responses that I've gotten from Christians have been overwhelmingly positive, because, you know, this is a book that says it doesn't matter what else you think about Jesus. Go ahead and think that he was God. Go ahead and think that he was the Messiah or the Son of God. Whatever else you think about him, he was also a man. And if he was a man, he lived in a specific time and place, and that time and place shaped who he was. And so this is a book about that time and place and the influence that it would have had on a poor Galilean peasant like Jesus.
Interesting. Your book has been criticized by some scholars as merely being an imaginative reconstruction of Jesus' life. You've said yourself that there are only a couple of historical facts about Jesus that can be consistently relied upon. Why is it so important to focus on examining the specific details of his life, Reza?
Well, yeah. So first of all, every reconstruction of the historical Jesus is an imaginative enterprise, because we know nothing. Take away the Gospels, and we know nothing about the Jesus of history except that he was a Jew, that he started a Jewish movement sometime in the first century, and that as a result of that movement, he was executed by Rome, and that's it. So how do you construct a biography out of those three factors? Well, the way that you do so is by placing him firmly in his time and place, because while we know very little about Jesus, we know a lot about the world in which he lived. And so all reconstructions of Jesus have to rely on the evidence of the world in which he lived to fill in the holes of his life. And, you know, some are more educated than others. Some are more, I think, reasonable than others. And I think some rely less on Christian accounts of Jesus than others do, like mine, for instance. But I think that, you know, it's a very difficult thing to do when you're dealing with a character that is shrouded in mystery, who is someone who is only written about through sacred history. In other words, the people who wrote about Jesus were not really concerned that much about the things that he did or said. They were far more concerned about who he was. And so the Gospels are not historical documents. They are theological documents. They are arguments of faith, not arguments of history. And so the trick then becomes, and this is something that's been going on for 200 years. I mean, I'm not the first person to do this. The trick then becomes figuring out what in the Gospels is more historically accurate and what isn't. And the way that we do that is by taking the claims of the Gospels and analyzing it according to what we know about the time of Jesus to see whether it can be trusted or not. And that's simply all that I do in this book.
Right. I'm glad you said that, because I think to a lot of non-religious observers, it seems like not just Christianity, but all religions have been so intertwined with politics and have such a forgotten message of its founders, even though, of course, it was a different time, as you mentioned. I mean, how can the divisive nature of religion today, in today's world, start to be reversed? Is it because of a literal interpretation of these texts? Or is that a contributing to it?
That has a lot to do with it. Though I always have to remind people that literalism is a very new phenomenon. I mean, in the 2,000-year history of the Gospels, it's only been 100 years in which Christians have read them as literal and inerrant. That might come as a shock to a lot of Christians because they think that, well, this is how the Gospels were always read. That's not true. The concept of literalism can be traced to the early 20th century, actually. A group of Protestants, particularly in the US and Europe, who in response to the scientific revolution decided that, you know, if that which is true is that which can be factually verified, then the Gospels must be able to be factually verified, otherwise they're not true. And that's never been how the Gospels were intended to be read. But that said, I think the real answer is that we have to start making a differentiation between religion and faith. These are not the same thing. Faith is indescribable, it's ineffable, it's deeply personal and individualistic. Religion is nothing more than a language made up of symbols and metaphors to help us express faith to ourselves, to other people. And in a sense, if we can just figure out that, you know, the faith that so many people around the world have is deeply held in common, and the religion is what's different. And if we stop confusing the religion, stop thinking about it as an end instead of a means to an end, stop thinking about it as the destination instead of a path to a destination, then I think we'll be in a better place to understand how much the values that matter the most we share in common, even though we may speak in a different language when it comes to those values.
Very well said, Reza Aslan. Really appreciate you coming on the show.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
I want to clarify, you're a Muslim, so why did you write a book about the founder of Christianity?
Well, to be clear, I am a scholar of religions with 4 degrees, including one in the New Testament and fluency in Biblical Greek.
Still begs the question, why would you be interested in the founder of Christianity?
Because it's my job as an academic. I am a professor of religion, including the New Testament. That's what I do for a living, actually.